Thank you for coming to our meeting. I'm glad to see so many people out here and the basic interest that we all have in history. And it's interesting. We have a very interesting speaker, a very well-known speaker here tonight. And I'm looking forward to his talk. Before we begin, we always do our land acknowledgement. And that's in respect of the First Nations people that lived in this area before we settled here as Europeans. So we respectfully acknowledge that the former village of Lakefield in the township of Selwyn is located on the Treaty Michi-Sagig territory and the traditional territory of the Michi-Sagig and Chippewa nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations, which include Curve Lake, Hiawatha, Alderville, Scugog Island, Rama, Beausoleil, and Georgina Island First Nations. Lakeville Historical Society respectfully acknowledges that the Williams Treaties First Nations are the stewards and the caretakers of these lands and waters in perpetuity, and that they continue to maintain this responsibility to ensure their health and integrity for generations to come. It's been months since we met. The last time we met here was in November, and I remember talking to the group here about that time about how now President Trump was the first convicted felon. At that time he hadn't been sentenced. And I think a lot of us were feeling hopeful that things would go in a different direction. However, he has returned as the 47th president. Now we're involved in a trade war that we never started. Poor people and challenged people are under attack in the United States. We must feel a little bit like the First Nations people did when they were threatened by a major imperial power. I mean, obviously the US is much more powerful militarily than Canada. Should they want to invade us and take over, there's probably very little that we could do.
Mike, they could take it, they couldn't hold it.
Probably. There's something to be said for that. But I'm just trying to imagine what it must have been like to live here as a First Nations people, and suddenly people come from another imperial country with superior technology, and they're saying, well, you know, glad you let us stay on your farm, but by the way, it's ours now. And when you look at that under the microscope of what we're looking at today, I think you can identify with what they felt. It started making me think about how old I am.
How old are you?
I'm old. And, you know, when I was a kid, I used to go to the liquor store, and they never asked me for proof of age, even when I was, we'll say, slightly under the age, 17 or 18 at that time. Yeah, and I never get asked. I must have looked old to begin with. Now, I don't get asked either. Right away, they bring me the seniors menu. They gave me the seniors discount. They put me in the seniors area where I'm sitting. Nobody asks how old I am. When I was young, I used to hope that pretty girls would notice me. Sorry, Dan, I did. And that's the way it was. They never did, except for my wife, of course. Now they do. When they see me, they say, "Sir, would you like my seat? Can I hold the door for you? You remind me of my grandfather." So that's great, they notice me now. But it's hard to fit into society when you get older. I know Michael Baird was telling me he was trying to identify with his spiritual side. And so he did one of these tests, find your spiritual animal online. And he went through all the questions. At the end of it, it came out his spiritual animal is extinct. I was talking to Maureen earlier. She's tried a new place for seniors dating. And she says it's wonderful. But the name of this place is called Carbon Dating. Always pick on Maureen. I was at Dr. Arthur's office earlier this week. My thumb was feeling stiff. I thought, you know, getting arthritis. So he carefully looked me over, he checked his computer, and he said, no. It's not arthritis, it's early onset rigor mortis. And that's what it's like to get old. So one thing for sure, if we ever actually do go to the war with the United States, we will win. You know why? Because we'll be hurt, and we'll be right back out there the next day, because we have free medical care. they don't. And it will be a big advantage. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. My notes say H. Jones, but I thought it was Elwood Jones. But anyway, there's an H here. He was born in Saskatchewan. He holds a Bachelor's of Arts from the honors degree from the University of Saskatchewan, an MA from Western, and a PhD from Queen's. He was an archivist with the Public Archives of Canada, now the Library and Archives of Canada, in 1964 to 67. And his archival career has included work with the National Archival Appraisal Board, 1970 to 2020, and with Trent Valley Archives, 1989 to present. He taught at Trent University, 1969 to 2006, and is Emeritus Professor at History at Trent. His many honors include Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal, a Paul Harris Fellow, and Janet Karakan Award for the Ontario Historical Society for Lifetime Achievement. He has written frequently for the Peterborough Examiner and was the Saturday Night columnist in 2007 and 2018. He's the author of nearly 20 publications, mostly related to Peterborough, and these include histories of St. John's Anglican Church, Peterborough, the Peterborough Agricultural Society, Nexicom, the Peterborough Fire Department, the Peterborough Golf and Country Club, and he's best known for his general works on Peterborough, the Electric City, 1987, and Historian's Notebook, 2009, and his current book, which you'll be talking about this evening, Peterborough's Unique, 2023. He's a board member for 9 Ships, 1825 Incorporated, and he's going to talk about his recent book, and I know we're all looking forward. Let's put our hands together and welcome Elwood Jones. Should work. Like much.
Thanks. Well, thanks very much for that introduction and the lesson on how to know when you're growing old. As if you could tell I started when I was in kindergarten with being a historian and archivist, so that's why I'm still around. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here tonight. The theme I wanted to talk about tonight was the link. Doesn't work. What's that? Is that better? No. People still can't hear me.
Turn the volume up a little inside, Mike.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
People said they can hear me now.
Yes.
Okay. So my most recent book is called Peterborough's Unique, and Stories from Canada's Average City. I've sort of felt about this over the years of thinking of the different ways in which along the way, because I didn't grow up in Peterborough, so of course I have to learn about Peterborough after coming here. And every so often I've learned something and think I know what I'm doing. And what I discovered was that in the early part of the 19th century, Peterborough was average for all of Upper Canada in terms of religion. This was mainly because the largest concentration of Roman Catholics was in Peterborough area, and it was sort of between Ottawa and Windsor, which had strong Roman Catholics. So the averaging worked out quite well that way. And it was interesting in looking at that to start to realize how the religion had worked there. That Peterborough was kind of a crossroads, this whole Peterborough County, was a crossroads between the Methodists who came up from Hastings, the Presbyterians who came up from Western Ontario through the Simcoe and Victoria County, and then of course Anglicans always went for the cities, and so that's, you get the mix all together there. So it was very interesting to see how that happened. But as time goes on, we again refer to it as the average city. It turns out it starts to tie in with the labor market and the fact that we didn't have major government offices here, and we didn't have the major industries here, So we had a bit of each and a bit of all running through there. And so again, we were kind of average for all these kind of things. So along the way, it was pointed out to me that if everybody else is above average and everybody else is below average, average must be very special. And so it's one of those things I discovered that my house in Peterborough is at the average for Peterborough real estate. And Peterborough is the average city. And so I think I'm living in the average house for Canada. Something like that. So it's interesting how these things come out. You start to realize the specialness that goes in this very way. And you can also see that from my perspective, it's always a comparison that I'm making with something else. Wherever I am, I've told people that if my library goes to any library, if they wonder if the book is about Peterborough, it is. It may not look like it. It may look like it's a book on Philadelphia. It may look like it's a book on Eastern England. But there will be a Peterborough link there if you know how to ask the questions that go through there. People will also ask about, I come from Saskatoon. Why would somebody from Saskatoon come to Peterborough? I said, well, I think about it. Both of them are on a river that the First Nations call Swift Flowing. Both of them have a downtown on the west side, a university on the east side. Both of them had a quick roads. Nowhere else in Canada had a quick road. And most of the electricians that came into General Electric were trained at the University of Saskatchewan. So you start to say that there's a lot of comparison that coming through here, that there's some, even in 1951, the population of both Saskatoon and Peterborough were about the same. So again, you get a sense of how things change. At any rate, this is my kind of sense of average. I'm not seeing average as a downer or anything like this. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about today, of course, is that there are connections between Peterborough and Lakefield, and that I have actually written on some of them. Before moving to Lakefield, Samuel Strickland lived in Peterborough. Now, most people don't know that, because all the books say that his first farm was in Autonomy Township. So I said, well, whereabouts in Autonomy Township would you be? Well, it turned out that he was on the location with now Nichols Oval. It's in Autonomy Township at the time, but it's very close to being everywhere else, eh? So it was very, very strange. He arrived the same year as the Robinson settlers, and decided that's why he wasn't going to stay in Peterborough. But anyway, so that's he looked up to going to Lakefield. Catherine Parr Trail arrived in the summer of 1832. We did a bus tour thing in Peterborough about, we called it the Summer of 32 to sort of echo the movie, The Summer of 42. But at any rate, it turns out that I worked on the assumption that if everything we learned in kindergarten. What about Catherine Parr Trail, when she arrives in Peterborough before she's ever heard of Lakefield? She spends the first 6 months in Peterborough while Thomas is trying to organize the land arrangements and deals. So all her first instincts in terms of botany, all those kinds of things that she became famous for, she encountered first in Peterborough. So again, it's an interesting link that crosses through. Now, one of the stories that I do feature in my book on Peterborough's Unique is about what I call the Cumberland settlers, sometimes called the Millburn Colony settlers. And when I first came to town, people called them colony settlers for short, but that's what it was, and Millburn was the leader of that particular expedition. Now this turned out to be a kind of an unusual story for me, because it turned out that in 1975, I was at Fort George near Niagara Falls, and there was a big clock from St. John's Church sitting smack dab in the middle of a whole bunch of War of 1812 artifacts. I said, well, that's really strange because there's no connection between St. John's and the War of 1812. And I, at that time, was working on writing the history of St. John's. So I went to the rector, Bill Moore, and said, why don't we ask ROM if they would let us borrow that clock for the sesquicentennial year that we're having in 1976. Well, they were not only eager to let us have it, they didn't want it back. so it's still in St. John's Church. So of course, I had a display, bring in clock collectors, people who collect clocks or anything like this. We're told that St. John's had this wooden clock that's going to be displayed. Well, they came in, they were all shocked because what we were talking about was a tower clock. So it's about 4 feet by 4 feet by 3 feet. And they were all expecting to be a metal clock like Terry made in Connecticut, or anything like that. So this sort of blew the mind. The person who was bringing in this particular clock, he now called it the Peterborough clock. You may think it's the town clock downtown, but no, it's this clock that is the Peterborough clock. And it's written about in a book on the history of clocks in Canada. But he looked at me and said, you know, this clock couldn't have been made in Peterborough. I said, oh, why? He said, it's too good. I thought, well, that darn snob from Toronto. So at any rate, that meant that I then had to give some thought to where the clock had come from. And the logic to think is that if it came from England, all I had to do was go to England and find out who made tower clocks that were wooden like this, and how could it possibly have got from England to here. Well, it turns out that again, I keep learning things every time I turn around. The Milburn settlers didn't all come in 1818. It was an arrangement in the town of Alston in England, was a community effort, and they said, you go off and get whatever you can in Canada, and we'll look after your kids and raise them so that by the time they're 18 or 19, it's safe to send them to Canada. So one of those sons was in a position to escort this wooden clock to Peterborough via the boat going across. So it turned out that I did have to go to Alston, and I was surprised. Alston claims to be the highest city in England. In fact, a sign on the local courthouse said, this is the highest court in the land. So it turned out that because they're up so high, there's a tradition of making clocks that's like the Swiss traditions of going through, that you're above the pollution in terms of this kind of thing. And so it was a real remarkable kind of a turn of events there. So then I said, well, would they have made wooden tower clocks in Alston? Because they made clocks, but did they make these big tower clocks? Well, it turned out they had made a big tower clock that's in Hexley, which is on the Hadrian's Wall, which is just north of Alston. It was meant to keep the Scots out of England, and apparently succeeded for a while. But that clock was not wooden, it was metal. So again, we're back to the kind of thing. So then, one of my trips to England, the Horological Society, which specialized on the history of clocks, announced that they had just received a beautiful wooden tower clock, and they were going to be on display at their museum. So I contacted them and said, how old is this wooden clock that you have? He said, well, built in 1945. I said, well, that's a little young for what I was looking for. So I said, are there any wooden tower clocks older than this? They said, we never heard of one that was older. than this. So I now begin to think that not only do I have sitting in St. John's, a very unique artifact for Peterborough, but this is for the world, as it were. There's a story here still to be told. But the fun for me was this hunt for trying to make a connection between a clock that had been in the tower of St. John's Church from 1839 until 1880. It was removed because it was only right twice a day. And so they moved it and kept it in the clock tower, and they replaced it with a bell. And the whole church was redesigned, so you couldn't tell by looking at it that there had been a place where a clock had been. Well, then, to celebrate the coronation of George V, they decided to put carillon, or a virtual carillon chime. It's not quite enough bells for a carillon, but it could be believed to one. So they put it in, but they needed the room for it. So the clock was removed from the tower in St. John's. They put in the library, which was a new library in Peterborough called the Carnegie Library. And it stayed there until the library decided they didn't want it anymore. So they gave a bill of goods to the Royal Ontario Museum about how this was such a terrific thing, they should have it. It's in pristine shape, everything is perfect. Well, it turned out everything wasn't perfect. They replaced the front panel with a piece of plywood. We know that nowhere near going to do a clock face, you know. So there's a lot of work to be done on that. But that's just an example, though, of how you get sucked into a story, and it just doesn't always end that way. The next story that I was sort of mentioning here, the Peterborough Fire Department came to Lakefield in 1880 to fight a disastrous fire at the Strickland Mill. Now, this was a surprise to me in a number of different ways. Because I've been writing the history of the Peterborough Fire Department, they never left town. But this was the exception. 1880, they all got on a train from Peterborough to Lakefield, rode up, and they had the flat cars to bring on the extra firefighting equipment that they needed and things like this, and arrived up to fight the fire. Now this was interesting in a number of ways. They were a little bit late. They didn't rescue the mill, so there is that problem. But Mr. Strickland, R.A. Strickland, R.C. Strickland, who was the reeve at that time in 1880, refused to pay any of the expenses that the Peterborough Fire Department had gone, because he said Lakefield could do it on their own. They didn't need Peterborough, you see. We could burn it to the ground without your help. So that turned out to be the way that worked. But the moment of discovery here, this is called the Strickland Mill in 1880. But it turns out it wasn't Strickland's that owned it. It was owned by Senator James Gibb Ross, who was a senator for Quebec City, so then I got in the story, and you probably read it in the Lakefield Herald, that Bolton was with Strickland and Company when it went bankrupt. He left before it went bankrupt. So what happened was that Charles Bolton, well, I'm rushing ahead of my story here, so we'll hang on to that one. The next colorful kind of a person that I ran into that runs into Peterborough and Lakefield is the Reverend Vincent Clementi. Now this is a guy that has fascinated me for quite a bit, and of course in Lakefield he was for a while the rector of St. John's Church, and he was obviously the very prominent Mason, because the Masonic Lodge is called the Clementi Lodge. So we know the link there, and he's a fantastic painter. Anytime you see his prints, they just stand out really quite well. I wish more of them were in public kind of domain. But it turned out that he also was a big player in Peterborough. They're actually sort of celebrating his 150th anniversary at All Saints Church even as we sort of speak, because that was where he went, and he started a mission into the South End, which right on this idea of where the South End is in Peterborough is itself always a fascinating kind of a story. But at any rate, that was created at that time. He ends up, well, one of the stories I run into, he raised $4,000, or led a campaign to raise $4,000 to help the operatives in Liverpool who had lost their jobs because of the American Civil War, which meant that the blockade of the north of the south prevented the cotton from the south getting to England, where it could be manufactured into cotton. Now, this was a surprise to me, because I taught American history at that time, and I was always under the impression that the South always said, you can declare a blockade all you want, but you can't stop us from getting through. Well, it turned out they could. It turns out that because of that, the South lost the market in cotton. It went to Egypt and India. But it took about 3 years for that to happen. But in that in-between period, here they are raising $4,000 in Peterborough to go for this project. So the ladies of Peterborough said, we have poor people in Peterborough too. Number one cause of poverty in Peterborough, winter. Number two cause, husbands. and so they started the Peterborough Relief Society, which eventually merges into what in modern time we would have recognized as Anson House, but its roots were there in 1862. And so I thought that was strange, because in 1862 they didn't have such an organization in Toronto or London or Ottawa, but they had it here in Peterborough. So you sort of say, well, we aren't waiting for anybody else to do stuff. When it finally came to getting suggesting that they should apply for the government grants 20 years later, it turns out that the government said, well, they didn't build this according to government regulations. They just did their own stuff. So then they had to kind of figure out if they were eligible for government grants. It turned out they decided to hold their nose, get the grant. So there is, again, an interesting story that Clementi runs through a lot of different stories. I wrote about him, but I was actually more fascinated by his father, who made a fortune as a musician. And I thought, well, that's really a good track. This is, that's another story. At any rate, so we can see that the Anglican connection between Lakefield and Peterborough is represented a bit by what Clementi did. We also know that there were people like the Baptists and the Kingans, and who was I told today, the Dewarts also were both Lakefield and Peterborough. So again, we have these kind of families that work together, often because of construction, one way or another. But the distance between Peterborough and Lakefield is sufficient for each of them to have their own distinctive kind of sort of mentality, but they're also close enough that they can share things at different times. And that's part of what I wanted to say. The other kind of story where you start to see how Lakefield and Peterborough come together is on the temperance battles. And there are parallel histories here, not intertwined, parallel. The first instinct with the Scott Act gave it that localities could declare themselves to be dry, and that nobody could sell liquor in their boundaries. So in Peterborough, turned out that the town of Peterborough voted to go dry, the village of Lake Ashburnham voted to go wet. Peterborough had another vote to see if they could get people to persuade that if Ashburnham could be wet, we better be wet as well. So we had that happening. Well, it turned out Lakefield had the same thing. They had 3 temperate battles in a year and a half, in which they voted dry, wet, dry, sort of thing. So it was kind of interesting. And in those cases, it's kind of interesting because we actually have the poll books for who voted wet and who voted dry in each of those elections. And so it's possible to get another kind of insight into how ordinary people, mostly men of course, but how ordinary people responded in the 1870s and 1880s. So, at any rate, the obvious link between Peterborough and Lakefield, the Autonomy River and Highway 28. So we know that. So the story that I wanted to focus on today was Charles A. Bolton, which you of course have all read about just recently in the Lakefield Herald. But let me tell you how I got linked into this this fascinating story. I think Bolton is really an amazing individual. The Dictionary of Canadian Biography has a biography of him that is actually pretty poor. It's not well researched, and it certainly doesn't do fairness to the kind of person that Bolton was. But on the plus side, there's very few people from Lakefield and Peterborough that make it into the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. You know, count the Stricklands, count the Trail, the Moody's, that's it. You know, so at any rate, Bolton turned out lived in Raden Manor. Raden Manor is the place where Samuel Strickland is identified with. It's called the Homestead. And it turns out that Roland married the sister of Charles A. Bolton. So as a result of this, Charles A. Bolton had a room in Raden Manor, and he also was courting his future wife, Augusta Lapa, who lived in Aurelia at the time. So what do you find? He starts writing in the letters here. He says, "You might be interested in what happens in this house." And if she wasn't, I was. And it's very interesting to get inside gossip about what happens in a house that is high profile as that house is. What we learn is that Charles didn't have a lot of respect for the Stricklands. He felt none of them had any business sense whatever. So it was a pretty damning thing. So it turns out that he's actually partnered with Roland Strickland in the Roland Strickland Company, and they run the mill in Lakefield. And from that position, it turns out that when Lakefield becomes a incorporated village in 1874, the first brief is Charles Bolton. And of course, for somebody like me from Peterborough, said, "Oh, shouldn't it have been a Strickland? Why would it be Bolton, who would not only be the first brief, but was reelected twice after that?" So we have here a kind of sense that the people in Lakefield knew where the brains were and where the money was. And I think what we have here is a situation where Charles A. Bolton is the silent partner. He's providing the money that goes into the Strickland Company. And the money he's supplying is coming from his father, who is Darcy Bolton, and who lived in Coburg, and was connected with all the other Boltons that we know about running through. But these were very prominent family compact and investor type people. So what I think happened, and which the DCB authors didn't know, but interesting, we have these papers at Stratton Valley Archives in the land records, because land is involved in all these various things. So it turns out that after Charles Bolton left from Strickland, but was still staying in Lakefield, it turns out that they turned to Senator Shaw, to Senator Ross, to invest. So Senator Ross had already been in for $35,000, and he upped the mortgage to $80,000 for the Strickland Company, which now had as partners Roland and Robert, but still was called Roland Strickland Company. So that's where people don't notice how Bolton disappears from the story here. But it turned out that $80,000 was too big of a bite for the Stricklands. And so so it turns out that by the time in 1880, when this fire department comes into town, it's already owned by Senator Ross, and he's the guy who loses all the money. So I thought, well, poor guy. So what do we know about Senator Ross? He comes to Quebec City as a teenager, age 16, is on a deal to work with the family business, which was merchant trade between Scotland and Quebec. Well, it turns out he's there for the first year to work just for room and board. Second year, he owns a company. The third year, they're investing in all sorts of mills and things like this. It turned out that there were about 40 or 50 mills across Upper Canada that were owned by Senator Ross. He, of course, was given a position in the Senate because he was a prominent type of person this way. So it turns out that this land that had been the collateral for the mortgage in $80,000 went to Ross, and Ross ended up donating it back to Lakefield. So, for example, the Hillcrest Cemetery was donated by Ross. You know, you sort of think, well, you see this, you sort of wonder how that happened, but there's how the connections go. So, at any rate, the question here about Charles Bolton is one that then kind of one that I have to sort of think about. After he left Strickland, he went west in 1880, possibly 1879, and he's the founder of the town of Russell, Manitoba, and ends up that there's still a major historic site in Russell, Manitoba, is the Charles Bolton House that is there. It's gone through various things. It's part of a hotel now, but nonetheless, we have that kind of sense there. We also know that that in these letters that were written to Augusta, it was the excitement to me was to find a story in the review. Most of us will know, of course, that when Charles Bolton was in Manitoba, when the Riel Rebellion broke out, he was pretty close to the center of action. And he actually met with Middleton in Winnipeg and volunteered to raise a bunch of scouts, sort of mounted scouts on horses and that would go out and work in connection with Middleton's army sort of thing. Middleton, in the meantime, who had been the head of RMC, suddenly was made the head of this expedition to put down the Riel Rebellion of 1885, which, as you might know, was the second Riel Rebellion. And so he was very happy to have help from Bolton. But Bolton's role here was really as a support role, running along in here. One of the people who was with him on this trip was Ted Brown, who was a son-in-law of Thomas A. Stewart and Francis Stewart. And so it's a Lakefield connection. Well, actually not quite Lakefield, because the farm, Goodwood, was right beside Trent University is now. But at any rate, that's the connection. He died at Batoche, single shot. It killed him, died very, very quickly after that. So he's buried in Batoche, and the family decided to leave him in Batoche because they did such a terrific job of commemorating him and picking the site and all those kinds of things. And so what they did instead, they put a monument in Confederation Park, which was at that time called Central Park, and the memorial was then dedicated by General Middleton in 1886, which is very quick to put that up. The monument was designed by Belcher. The monument is still there. It's been changed a bit. It used to have a water fountain. It used to be right across from City Hall. It's now been moved over closer to McDonald, but it's still in the same park. So I could take that as an example of Bolton's persuasiveness with his neighbors. So as I was reading these letters to Augusta, I suddenly perked up because it occurred to him, he says, we're going to have a military camp at Hunter's Grove, and I'm going to write the story for the Peterborough Review. Now this is exciting because 19th century newspapers never said who the author was of the articles that were written. So this is something itself that's quite unusual. But I had never heard about this particular military camp until I went there. I found out where Hunter's Grove is. Hunter's Grove is now what we would call Crawford's Grove. So in Peterborough, it's at the bottom of Monaghan Road, and it cuts across to where the Costco store is. So it's that area where they held this brigade association thing. So it turned out that the person who's in charge of the district camp, these would be all the militia units from Port Hope, Coburg, possibly Belleville, and Lakefield, Peterborough, and that area was called District 6. And the top military person in that area was Charles Bolton's father. So Charles Bolton is writing the report on this as a sort of a 2IC to his father. So what we find is that the camp began in 1873. So we're clipping back before the stories that we've told so far. And it's Tuesday, September 9th, the soldiers paraded through Peterborough on a Saturday afternoon. The town had a half-day holiday because the soldiers were here. So I tell you the kind of sense of importance that we attach to these things. On the following Monday afternoon and Tuesday at the camp, the Deputy Adjutant General came down from Ottawa to inspect the camp, praised the brigade for its fine appearance and good work. The citizens of Peterborough entertained the officers at a ball on Monday night. This was held at the drill hall, which was on what is now Confederation Park, but sort of in the middle of the block. Then the Horticultural Society held its annual fall exhibition at the same drill hall. Everybody's invited, including the soldiers. And this was combined with a concert called a promenade concert, which I suspect means that there's a little bit of dancing that goes with that. The 6th Brigade District Rifle Association then held a rifle tournament from Wednesday to Friday at the camp shooting range, which was near Hunter's Grove somewhere, possibly along the road there. The shooting competition was dogged with rain and wind. The Reverend Vincent Clementi presented the coveted medal for the best shot in the brigade, and this went to Corporal Sanderson of the 45th Battalion, which would be a battalion based out of Port Hope. The total value of the prizes was $450. $317 was in cash, and other things were in gifts of one sort or another. The best shot was presented by, as I say, by Clementi. Colonel Bolton added $10 in prize money. Captain Hughes of the same unit won a fur coat in the volunteer match. Peterborough's William English, which is connected with the English Canoe Company, one of the things that Peterborough is famous for, three of these things, was formerly of the 57th, competed as a citizen. In other words, you're no longer a military person, but competed as a citizen and won the all-comers match, and that was $15. The runner-up was Captain Johnson of the 57th. The 57th is the Peterborough area-based thing. In other words, we had it was Peterborough, Lakefield, Norwood, all of those areas were part of the 57th. And at any rate, Captain Johnson was the runner-up. He got $10. Private Samuel English, for the second time, won the New York medal. In the competition between battalions, Private Smith won $10 and Samuel English was declared the runner-up. won a pair of pants from A.W. Lasher and Company, apparently one of the department stores in town. The 57th Battalion won the competition overall, received $70. In that competition, each battalion brought their 10 sharpest shooters, and everybody fired 15 rounds for 200, 400, and 500 yards. This is in the wind and rain. I don't know how they could shoot that far at that time. So at any rate, this raises kind of interesting questions for me of how unusual this particular military event was. It seems to come almost every year. It's just that the place that it's held changes and runs through. But a correspondent in the review named Miles, which I don't think was Bolton, but anyway, Miles commented that the recent volunteer camp was distinguished by being entirely run by volunteers. There was no government funding, no professional soldiers were engaged for the training. It was all done by volunteers. The camp was successful because, quote, of orderly conduct in the men, constant drill, good rations, firing 20 rounds of ammunition, and being well commanded. So that's the summary coming through here. Now, this to me is a fairly important story in trying to make sense about Bolton. And the reason I say that is because if you read the DCP, it says that Bolton considered himself to be a military expert, but that he was really not very good at that because he didn't know anything about strategy, didn't know anything about these other kind of things. Well, I was sort of wondering about that. Bolton wrote a book with his memoirs called The Reminiscences of the Northwest Rebellion. Now, it's interesting that the Northwest Rebellion is, of course, the Riel Rebellion of 1885, but this chapter opens up with him getting his start in a military career. And it turns out that Britain, after the end of Britain, for the first time ever in 1855, raised a military unit in the colonies. Up until that, the military units had always been raised in England, Scotland, and Ireland, sort of thing like this. And the assumption always was that you couldn't get good soldiers in the militia, that these were just soft people, sort of holiday type people, and that kind of thing. But what you find with that story that we just told, the militia was a central feature in terms of defining local community spirit and in terms of keeping people connected with other people of their age and getting them into useful kind of exercises and getting an excuse to get a day off or 10 days off from work in order to do the annual thing here. So the theme that to me runs through Bolton's career is he's an advocate of the militia. And that this is what distinguishes Canada from other places. Now, you might argue that 1855 was a little early to be worried about setting up a militia, but it did turn out. I have here as my show and tell item 4 medals that were given to Lakefield infantry people who fought in the 1866 Fenian Rebellion. They were all volunteers, all militia. You could say they weren't professional soldiers, they weren't that. So anyway, it wasn't given to them until after the Riel Rebellion, because that's when suddenly the Canadian government decided, well, maybe giving medals to people who do important things isn't such a bad idea. So the people who get the medal are people who managed to fight in 1866 and were still living in 1890. So you've got that kind of sense here. But I really like this as an illustration of what the Lakefield infantry looked like in 1866 and fighting with this. Now, if you place this in the context, we had what was called the American Civil War that went from 1861 to 1865. And the militia activity was increased in that period because there was concern that if there's 500,000 soldiers suddenly win a battle, win a war in the States, what's to stop them from turning around and completing what they didn't do in 1812? So we have a kind of a sense of worry about this. Now, to top all this off, the British government decided that Canada should fend for itself because it now had Confederation in 1867. Confederation didn't give Canada all the rights we'd expect. That didn't all come until 1927 with the Statute of Westminster. But what it did get was in 1870, the British withdrew all their troops from Canada. So that meant from that point on, it was going to be the militia to have to do it. And so when Middleton is leading that battle into the Riel Rebellion, this is the first time an all militia kind of unit is brought into place to have to deal with things. At the same time as they're doing that, like the comment, 1885, that a Peterborough man who had made a career in the Peterborough militia had gone to Winnipeg at the time of 1870, which also the story involves Charles Bolton, but I'll leave that for another day. But what's interesting, I often tell my friends from Winnipeg that if it wasn't for Peterborough, it wouldn't be a Winnipeg. There's a lot of sets to go with that. I could give a similar story, but not to belabor things. So what we get a sense here then is that Bolton writes in the first part of a book on the reminiscences of the Northwest Rebellion about his first military experiences, which is graduating at the age of 18 in 1855, and said, wouldn't it be nice to get a military career? And the only thing that was being offered was that the British had decided to set up a colonial battalion because of the concerns of India, where we'd had the uprising in India in 1857. So Bolton was told that the positions of officers had all been filled up, but if he went and recruited some people, he might be able to go as an officer into this unit of they were called the 100th Canadian Regiment sort of thing. So it turns out that he did get a filled-in position, but what he did in the meantime was he went all around Lindsay, Lakefield, Peterborough, Norwood, and raised 20 people to go with him in this new thing. And because he had raised these 20 people, he went as an ensign, which is a pretty low position as an officer, but at least it's an officer. And so he goes to England for this. It turns out that this unit, much to my surprise, doesn't go anywhere near India. They go to Gibraltar for about 5 years, and then they go to Malta for another 5 years. And Bolton's, at the end of this, is still an ensign. So he had to use this to try to make up his position. But you can see that after 10 years, it's 1868 when he comes back to Lakefield. So he's not one of the people who gets this Fenian Raid medal. But on the other hand, he's one of the inspirations for that kind of activity. And so what happens then, when he goes to West in 1885, he ends up being able to fight in the first all-militia kind of thing. Now I think, have I run out of time? At any rate, that's the story that I want to tell, that his importance in Canadian military history is as a champion of the militia, and the importance of the militia as a defining difference between what the British idea of the military and the army was and what the Canadian one turned out to be. Now, I was going to tell, Mike said I could tell 3 stories, but the book has 50. So I chose, this is my second one, which is a short story, but this is a book about the Diamond Jubilee of Confederation which I thought was kind of interesting. We celebrated the Diamond Jubilee rather than the Golden Jubilee because the Golden Jubilee was in the middle of the World War I. And so we waited a bit of time coming through here. But what we end up in this book is a story of a community that goes together and produces artistic plays, musical events, parades. And this is one of the best parades I've ever seen, judging from the pictures that go through here. But as you go through this, we get certain things that, I'm sure this is Lakefield, Grandma's wedding in 1867. It doesn't identify that, but that's my thinking. We have little Eva and Uncle Tom's Cabin. But the one that surprised me, we got a lot of Confederation themes running through here, no doubt about that. But the Bureau sends in they call it the Builders of Douro in 1867 sort of thing. So I thought it was kind of interesting that even in an event that was marking an event tied with Confederation, that the local people were able to find a way to celebrate the Robinson settlers. So this is one of the points I made in talking with the Nine Chips people, that these are the kind of little surprises that come through there, but you start to really realize that there's a sense in which this story has a holding power. It tells in 1867, it tells again in 1885, it's told again here in 1927, and so we're recreating some of these kind of things as quite a bit later. The other story that I was going to make as my third story was to talk more about the Alston connection. But I think I've probably given enough for some people to want to raise a question, and so I'll call it quits there, turn over to the chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elwood. I mean, certainly we'll open the floor if there are any questions that have for Elwood. Yes, my distinguished Mary Smith.
Elwood, thanks very much for the presentation. Who are the names of the people who received those medals? Do you have the names there?
Okay. People might want to come and look at that themselves closer up. The one here is Private David Mann, who would have been from Chemong Road, part of the thing. Then we have Sergeant Henry F. Mellor, M-E-L-L-O-R, Private George Bray, and Private John Watson. But what actually is kind of extra special in this is that we have a picture showing the infantry company in 1866, or thereabouts, as close as you could date it. And he also has a list of all the people who did receive it. These are only the ones that happened to fall in the hand of a collector. But the name here is 36, about 24 other names. And these again were people who survived to the 1890s from that 1866 thing. So if you look at it from that perspective, there is a Strickland on here, for example, so we get some kind of good names like this. We get Jones, Ball, Fitzgerald, a lot of our local Lakefield names that really resonate. So I'll put it on the table there at the end for people to take a closer look at. Thanks, Mike. Good question. I brought that as a tangential thing. I probably didn't make the point as clearly as I should have, that this is the militia thing that Charles Bolton is so proud of, and it's been represented in this. And I thought it was very interesting. If you want to talk in terms of the significance of Bolton as a military person, don't look for campaigns that he's in, don't look for how he goes up on General Middleton or things like that. Ask yourself how this continuity of theme running through there, that he does it not only in Gibraltar and Malta, he does it in Lakefield, he does it in Peterborough, and he does it in Russell, he does it in Winnipeg. You know, this is a guy who has a consistency on that, even though he manages to do an awful lot of other stuff. He isn't just a military guy. Okay, good question.
Any further questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, is there any connection between Charles Bolton and Bolton Castle in the Thousand Islands?
Oh, that's Bolt.
It's Bolton Castle.
Bolt, B-O-U. That's not the same name.
The answer is no.
Okay.
But there are connections. Charles, actually, James Forster reminded me of this not too long ago, but the Grange in Toronto, which became the home of what's now the Art Gallery of Ontario, was a Bolton home, and it was William H. Bolton. There were quite a big family. I noticed that when Gord Young wrote about similar stories, he makes George Strange Bolton as being the important person here rather than Darcy, which is what I put my emphasis on. But again, there's a connection there, and George Strange Bolton has also a Peterborough connection as well as the Coburg connection. His son-in-law was Canon Beck, who was the longtime minister at St. John's Church in Peterborough. And it turned out that when Beck came to town, he had one of the nicest homes in the area, called St. Leonard, which was on what became the site of St. Joseph's Hospital. And in there runs a lot of stories. It turned out that George Strange lost a lot of money because he invested in a bridge over Rice Lake. and so the result was that they lost control of St. Leonard. So suddenly Canon Beck was without a palatial home that he'd been kind of used to, sort of thing. Bishop Strachan came to town and berated the local congregation for not having built a house for Canon Beck, probably unfairly in terms of the long history that goes with this. But that is the connection that runs through there. So the truth is that there's a lot of connections between those Boltons, but this Bolton is with a U. Now there's a lot of Boltons between here and Peterborough that are with the O, and they don't seem to be related. This family seems to be mainly tied with the family compact along Lake Ontario to Toronto, and later, of course, in the range towards Winnipeg that we see with Charles. Good question, though.
We probably have time for one more question if there's someone with a burning question.
Well, if people want to talk to me, I'll be around for a while
Yes.
afterwards.
So on behalf of the Lakefield Historical Society, we'd like to thank you, Elwood, for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
And appreciate you coming out. And Elwood, you didn't mention it, but Elwood does have a number of books available for sale on the back table. He's given us a special deal. The one is priced at $60, the other is $40. And if you buy both, he'll sell them to you both for $100. So only a special tonight I'm giving us Elwood, so that's perfect. So just a couple of words with regards to our next meeting, which is happening on the 24th of April. Want to be able to introduce our speaker for the next meeting, which is Michael Patterson. Who writes about Catherine Parr Trail as a botanist. So this is a little bit of a different twist on Catherine Parr Trail. We've heard a lot and have had speakers before with regards to her writings. This is with regards to her as a botanist, and he will talk a lot about her herbarium. And again, if you don't know what a herbarium is, neither did I till tonight either. So Laura up here at the back is an expert in this area, and it was her final one that she made and put together that was made in Lakefield, and he will be here talking about that as well. We also have a special treat at the next meeting. We will, if you want to bring a couple of historical photos, We will set up a scanning mechanism so that we can help you scan your old photos into a JPEG format and then be able to give that to you. Michael, our expert here, is available at a very small fee to be able to fix any of the old photos. He was able to fix one of my family photos, and I was able to lose 30 pounds in a few seconds. So I really was eye candy. So that's 24th of April. That is, again, doors open at 7. We'll be starting at 7:30. If you want to be able to have some of your photos taken care of, please feel free to come early. We're usually here at least by 6:30 in order to be able to help you with regards to that. And if you do have some very significant historical photos, we're going to ask that we'll certainly give you a PDF or a JPEG. We're hoping that we may be able to keep a copy of it for continuing to build the Lakefield Historical Society photos as well. Many of those photos can be seen on the Vintage Lakefield. They are also on our Lakefield Historical Society page. And certainly the late John Millage utilized most of the photos on his Vintage Lakefield site. They're Lakefield Historical Society photos. And in honor of John Millage and his love of history, we're certainly making sure that legacy continues to live on as well. So we thank you for that. We do have our 50-50 draw.
Moment you've all been waiting for.
Yes, and as you know, Ann Sullivan at the back, most of you will probably know Ann Sullivan. We wanted to make sure Ann came back because she's one of our greatest salespeople, because you can't get past Ann without being asked to buy a 50-50 ticket. I'm new to Lakefield, not that new, but new enough that I don't know everybody. I know where her brother lives, but I didn't know where Ann lives, so I kind of Googled her. And of course, found out, I kept Googling Ann Sullivan, of course, kept coming up with Helen Keller's teacher, but I knew that wasn't what I was looking for. So we do have our 50-50 draw, so I'll ask be able to come forward. And Elwood, because you're a neutral individual, we'll let you pull the number here. So.
I managed to get in without being told to invest in this.
You're the only neutral body in the room. Okay, thank you, Elwood. 670-3157.
There you go. Okay. Yeah, so the winning is $55, and we can meet at McDonald's afterwards. So with that, and I again want to thank everybody for being able to come tonight. I would again thank you very, very much. I mean, you are a walking Canadian encyclopedia of history and such an advocate of Peterborough and Lakefield and local history. Your contribution has been incredible. Joining or moving to Lakefield a few years back, I mean, you are required reading for anybody that has a desire to be able to understand the connections. Not that I understand it. I know every time I talk to somebody, they're related to somebody else. I'm beginning to think Lakefield is also like incestuous Kentucky or something like that. But indeed, the connectivity between the families, and you just know the information just like that. And so it's been a great pleasure to be able to have you here. So thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And we look forward to being able to see you again on April the 24th as well. Thank you very much.